for my colleagues, we're going to get it. I don't know when, I don't know how, because I don't control that. But I'm going to make darn sure we're going to get it. And not much, if anything, substantive is going to happen until we do. This is overdue because this goes into effect today. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Waiting for a senator to come to the floor. Earlier today, the Senate rejected a House proposal to go to conference to negotiate the differences between the two bodies in regard to the government funding and the health care law and the ensuing shutdown of the government. AP reporting that the GOP-controlled House intends to pass legislation to reopen portions of the government, including national parks and processing of claims at the Department of Veterans Affairs. The House would also allow the government in the Washington, D.C. to use its own taxpayer funds to provide services like garbage pickup, as well as keep D.C. employees on the job. The closure of national parks is among the most visible effects of the partial government shutdown. It would reopen gates at visitor centers at parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone.
Mr. President,
Senator from Massachusetts.
I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I ask to be recognized for 6 minutes.
Without objection.
What we have here, Mr. President, is the Tea Party Republicans' version of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. More than 40 years ago, Dr. Kubler-Ross laid out the 5 different emotions experienced by people when they face what they consider to be an awful, unacceptable fate. Making unaffordable health care available for millions of Americans is anathema to today's Tea Party Republicans. They cannot accept it. They shut down the government to try to stop it. The Tea Party Republicans just cannot handle the fact that the Affordable Care Act will guarantee that millions more Americans are going to have access to quality, affordable health care coverage. That being a woman is no longer going to be a pre-existing condition. Women cannot be charged higher insurance rates just because of their gender. No one is going to go bankrupt just because they get sick. Before the Affordable Care Act, medical bills contributed to more than 60% of all personal bankruptcies in the United States. Let me say that again. Before the Affordable Care Act, medical bills contributed to 60% of all personal bankruptcies in the United States. That all ends with Obamacare, which lifts lifetime caps on insurance coverage. 6.6 million people on Medicare have already saved more than $7 billion on their prescription medicines so far. The Tea Party Republicans are in the grip of the political equivalent of the 5 stages of grief. And it is the American people who are getting squeezed. The first stage, denial. The Tea Party Republicans refuse to accept the fact that the Affordable Care Act is the law. They have tried to repeal it more than 50 times. It has been ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court. They ignore last year's presidential election in which the Republican candidate who promised to repeal the Affordable Care Act, if he was elected, was soundly defeated. The Tea Party Republicans deny the decision by the Supreme Court that found the Affordable Care Act constitutional. The second stage, anger. The Tea Party Republicans are enraged that the Affordable Care Act is going to work. We know it is going to work because we have 7 years of experience in Massachusetts, where now 97% of all adults and 99% of all children are covered. We have a poll conducted in April of this year by the Massachusetts Medical Society. It indicates that 84% of Massachusetts residents are satisfied with their health care. They like their health coverage under the Massachusetts system, which is the very model of President Obama's plan. The Tea Party Republicans cannot stand the fact that the Affordable Care Act will finally make health care a right and not a privilege in our country, in the words of the great Ted Kennedy. The Tea Party Republicans are so angry about Obamacare that they closed down the federal government today, sending hundreds of thousands of federal workers home without pay. The third stage, bargaining. The Tea Party Republicans are doing a lot of bargaining these days. They are using the entire federal budget and soon the full faith and credit of the United States as leverage in their negotiation to try to gut Obamacare. Bargaining rarely provides a sustainable solution, especially in this case. That's because the Tea Party Republicans do not really want to negotiate. They want to eliminate the Affordable Care Act and the benefits it provides to millions of Americans. They say they want to bargain, but they don't. They say they want to negotiate, but they don't. They just want elimination of the health care program, and that is not going to happen. The fourth stage, depression. The Tea Party Republicans are clearly depressed that they are getting blamed for shutting down the government, that public opinion is sharply turning against them, and that many Republicans are repudiating their tactics and their extremism. Republicans are fighting amongst themselves, struggling to find a way out of the mess that they have made for themselves. And finally, the fifth stage, acceptance. The Tea Party Republicans have not yet reached this final stage of acceptance. They still do not fully understand the backlash that they are facing from the public, which will justifiably blame them for the Republican Tea Party shutdown. The Tea Party Republicans do not yet regret their destructive ways. They certainly are nowhere near acceptance. And so I say, Mr. President, we are witnessing the Tea Party Republicans in the throes of their grief over losing the last election and losing the battle over health care reform. But it is the American people who are paying the price for this political psychodrama that is tearing the Republican Party apart and hurting our country and hurting the health of millions of Americans in our country. Now is the time for them to get over it. Now is the time for Obamacare to be the law of the land. It is not going away. Now is the time to join together to ensure that it works for the American people. Now is the time to move forward, to pass a budget that funds our government. Now is the time to get our economy back on track, create jobs, and build a bright future together for all Americans. Now is the time for the Tea Party Republicans to accept what the American people have voted to make the law of our land and the person who they voted to make the president of our country. I thank you, Mr. President, and I yield back the balance of my time. And at this point, Mr. President, I doubt the presence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
While we wait for a senator to speak, here's a quick recap of the Senate today. The Senate voted to reject the latest House Republican effort to negotiate on the budget and the government shutdown. The party line vote was 54 to 46 this morning. The Senate turned down a House request to name negotiators to a conference to resolve differences. Majority Leader Harry Reid said he wouldn't negotiate as long as Republicans were holding up a straightforward spending bill to keep the government operating. The vote marked the fourth time that the Democratic-controlled Senate has rejected House Republican efforts in this shutdown fight. The Hill is also reporting that House Republicans will move to reopen small portions of the federal government, bringing up bills to fund the National Park Service, part of the Department of Veterans Affairs, and operations for the District of Columbia. Party leaders announced the plan to their members during a closed-door meeting at the Capitol this afternoon, some 13 hours after the federal government shut down amid the budget impasse. The House is expected to vote early this evening on 3 separate bills which would come to the floor under a suspension of the rules and require a 2/3 majority to pass. So that means the measures would need significant Democratic support and would allow Republicans to blame Democrats if they failed. While we're in this quorum call, we're going to show you some tweets from members of Congress.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I ask consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd like to speak about the shutdown that has now occurred.
Without objection.
Mr. President, to say that I am outraged is an understatement. What we need is for the folks down there at the other end of the United States Capitol building to open up this government. The economy of this country is at risk, and they have done it to advance their own narrow extremist agenda. And so all of this is due to a relatively small group of lawmakers down in the House of Representatives, some 40, maybe 60, who are intent on having their own way on a personal agenda and who are refusing to work with their fellow Republicans as well as Democrats down in the House of Representatives. And the result is what we have, a forced government shutdown that's doing a lot of damage to a lot of people. And that's why it's important for the American people to say that they've had enough and they want these folks to stop this nonsense. Now, we ought to be keeping the government open, but consider a couple of things. Consider, for example, at the National Institute of Health, that they are now unable to bring in 800 patients that they were going to start to give medical treatment in breakthrough medical techniques and developments. 800 folks. And at the same time, what the National Institute of Health, one of the premier agencies in all of this alphabet soup of agencies that we talk about NIH, they've had to lay off, furlough 70% of their civilian workforce. All right, a few minutes ago you heard the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Senator Dianne Feinstein, out here explaining that the Director of National Intelligence has told her that he has had to furlough 72% of the civilians in the intelligence community. I mean, that's ridiculous. We've got terrorists that are trying to do us harm. And he's had to furlough 72%. Take, for example, NASA. 92% of NASA civilian workers, not 92, 97% of the space program is being laid off.
Mr. President, would my friend, the distinguished senator from Florida, yield for unanimous?
Of course I would, to the majority leader, and I want to thank him for his leadership, and I want to thank him for standing firm to stop this nonsense.
Mr. President, I appreciate my friend. We served together in the House. I ask that his statement not appear interrupted in the record.
Without objection.
I ask that the Chair lay before the Senate a message from the House with respect to H.R. 2642.
Chair lays before the Senate a message before the House.
Resolved that the House agree to the amendment of the Senate to the bill H.R. 2642, entitled An Act to Provide for Reform and Continuation of Agricultural and Other Programs of the Department of Agriculture through fiscal year 2018 and for other purposes, with an amendment to the Senate amendment.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate disagree on the House amendment. The Senate insist on its amendment. request a conference of the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and the chair be authorized to appoint conferees with a ratio of 7 to 5 on floor of the Senate, all with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that there be a period of morning business for debate only until 6 p.m. with the time equally divided and controlled between two leaders or the designees. Senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each for debate only. And at that
Without objection.
and at 6 o'clock I be recognized.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the chair appoints the following conferees on the part of the Senate.
Senators Stabenow, Leahy, Harkin, Baucus, Brown, Klobuchar, Bennett, Cochran, Chambliss, Roberts, Bozeman, and Hoeven.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
All right, as I understand what the majority leader has just done, the Senate has appointed conferees on the Farm Bill. All right, there is an example of where, when you have the political will, you can get together and you can get things accomplished. And giving the examples of the National Institute of Health and how they're being decimated, how NASA is being decimated, how all of the intelligence agencies, 72% of all the civilians in the intelligence agencies, Reid, CIA. Folks, we're in a war with those people that are trying to do harm to us. And we're having these people furloughed all because of a small group who are intent on their agenda, a small group of the Tea Party in one house of one branch of government are being irresponsible and reckless. Now, the truth is, if the Speaker would just bring up what we call the continuing resolution, which is all of the appropriations bills put together up to a date certain, November the 15th, if the Speaker of the House just brought that up, it would pass overwhelmingly with Democrats and Republicans both voting for it, not the extremist small group down there. But the Speaker doesn't bring it up. And so what I see is happening, if this lasts for more than a day or two, the American people are going to get so irritated that their lives are disrupted, that they can't get government services. And I think the people of this country are going to be so upset that they're going to insist that their government open up once again. Now, I want to give you an example. Mr. President, I am never ceased to people that I have the privilege of working with do for the people of my state. And so it is not unusual when I'm going into a meeting or I'm in the airport or I'm walking down the street, wherever I am in the state of Florida, it is clearly commonplace for people to come up and say to me, I want you to know that I appreciate so much what you did to help me out, what you did for my mother, my son, my brother who is a veteran. And what they're talking about is all of these dedicated people that I have the great privilege of working with me to help the people of our state on the day-to-day necessities of their daily lives, such as they're in an emergency situation, they realize that their passport is expired or they lost their passport, or they didn't get their veterans payment, or they need help getting their brother into a veterans hospital, or something happened to their Social Security payment, or they need information about this particular piece of legislation, or they're concerned about somebody that they saw that they thought were doing things and they need them to be referenced to the correct agency on a security matter. I mean, it goes on and on. And these wonderful people that we have working with us, some young, some older, many of the ones that have been with me for years, they are so dedicated and they work day and night. They work their fingers to the bone. They know exactly who to call or to email to get things done for people back home in need. And now, Mr. President, you know what's going to happen? They call any one of our offices in Florida. They're going to get a recording of my voice telling them what has happened and how all of these folks have been furloughed, and giving them an emergency contact as the one lifeline that we can provide. So what happens next, Mr. President? If reasonable people were doing this, we would have never shut down in the first place. If people who were bipartisan, who had some common sense, who recognized that you can't have it your way all the time, but in the best of American tradition, that you have to respect the other fellow's point of view and then work out your differences to achieve a consensus in order to gain a workable solution. If those kind of reasonable folks had been operating, then we would have never shut down in the first place. And so we had asked, and you've heard this over and over in the speeches today, I had voted for in the Budget Committee a budget. It came out, it came to the floor. We had over 100 amendments. It took hours and hours, and we finally passed a budget, which was the outline for the appropriations for the next fiscal year. We passed that in the Senate 6 months ago. The House did the same thing. They passed out a budget. But when we asked to go to a conference committee to get agreement of working out the differences between the two, that small group would not let the conference not only convene, but even be appointed. Mr. President, I think the majority leader of the U.S. Senate will tell you that we're ready to meet right now. But they've got to open up the government again. And we've got to put these people back to work that are trying to serve the American people and to protect the American people. And hopefully, if the American people hear these messages, they will get sufficiently agitated and insist that once again, the crowd that has shut us down instead should open up the government. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to call for an end of the senseless government shutdown and urge members of the House to set aside political games for the betterment of the country. The American people, Mr. President, are tired of our country being held hostage and our economic recovery threatened just to score political points, and justifiably so. There are real consequences for this irresponsibility. Shutting down the government for 3 or 4 weeks would reduce real gross domestic product by 1.4 percentage points in the fourth quarter alone, and a shutdown longer than 2 months would likely precipitate another recession. But you don't have to take my word for it. Here is what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce said in a letter on this very topic. Quote, It is not in the best interest of the U.S. business community or the American people to risk even a brief government shutdown that might trigger disruptive consequences or raise new policy uncertainties washing over the U.S. economy. David Coate, the chief executive officer of Honeywell, stated that if you want to create economic disruption and uncertainty for businesses, that a government shutdown is a great way to do it. I couldn't agree more. The truth is we simply can't afford another self-inflicted wound to our economy, especially not at a time when things are finally turning around. We had good news in our state this month. The unemployment is down to 5.1%. National unemployment at 7.3%. That's the lowest point since December of 2008. The housing market is bouncing back, with existing home sales reaching a 6.5-year high in August. Retail sales are up, and so far this year we've added 1.5 million private sector jobs. We're not where we need to be, Mr. President, but we're moving in the right direction, and it's clear that now is not the time to take a step back. And yet here we are again, right in the middle of another manufactured crisis. On Friday, the Senate passed a bill to keep the government running that is free of any ideological policy provisions. The Senate bill would fund the government at the same level as last year through November 15th and would give Congress and the President time to negotiate a balanced deficit reduction plan. The common sense next step would be for the House to take up and pass the Senate's bill. That's democracy. They should put the bill before the House, and by most belief, it would pass and it would end the shutdown. Instead, the House sent us 4 separate versions of the legislation with full knowledge that the Senate would not agree to them and the President stating that he would veto them. Each of the House proposals would have delayed implementation of the Affordable Care Act. So here we stand with the federal government shut down just so that House Republicans could again attempt to relitigate a law that both the House and the Senate passed, the President signed, and the Supreme Court upheld. That doesn't mean, Mr. President, that there will be no changes to the law going forward. I know you have some ideas from the great state of West Virginia. I have some ideas, but they must be made in a rational manner, not as part of poison pill partisanship. House Republicans don't seem to understand, or they choose not to care about the negative impact on businesses and families that a government shutdown would have. Here are some examples of how my state would be impacted, and I know the senator from Delaware, Senator Coons, is here, and I noted that he has some examples on his piece of paper. This is the story in Minnesota. According to the Small Business Administration, in 2012, their loan programs approved 53,847 applications and supported 571,383 jobs for an average of just over 1,000 applications per week. What does this mean for Minnesota? Well, my state is home to 115,000 small business, and I want to ensure that the SBA loans keep coming through. All lands managed by the National Park Service in Minnesota would be closed. They are closed. These include Voyageurs National Park, the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, the North Country National Scenic Trail, the Pipestone National Monument, and the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway. Closures of the parks will result in a loss of tourism revenue. Last year, more than 600,000 visitors enjoyed these parks, an average of more than 1,600 visitors per day. And according to the National Park Service, in 2011, visits in these parks in Minnesota contributed $37 million in economic benefits and generated 665 jobs in my state. In a state like Minnesota, where tourism is our 5th largest industry and the source of 11% of all private sector revenue, we simply can't afford for this to happen. We simply cannot afford for this critical industry to be hamstrung by political posturing. In the shutdown, the Food and Drug Administration will furlough 7,000 people, roughly 55% of the agency's workforce. That means the process for approving life-saving drugs and treatments and devices, something that matters a lot in my state, would grind to a halt, and shipments arriving at our ports from overseas will no longer be monitored by the FDA. This shutdown also has the potential to slow down research at the Mayo Clinic. The bulk of Mayo's funding for research comes from the National Institutes of Health grants. In the government shutdown, 70% of NIH staff is shut out. As Senator Mikulski has said on this floor many, many times, 70% the National Institute of Health staff. That represents about 19,000 American scientists, researchers and others who are working to develop a cure for Alzheimer's, working to develop a cure for muscular dystrophy, working to develop a cure for autism. Staff from the Mayo Clinic said that if the government shut down, the NIH will not be reviewing new grant proposals, and that is starting today. In addition, it means funding for recently approved grant projects won't be released, and new patients will not be admitted to the NIH Clinical Center or allowed to begin new clinical trials. We must also be willing to do the right thing for the safety of our people. That is, all in all, in my belief as a former prosecutor, the #1 duty of government, to keep our people safe. When it comes to homeland security, counterterrorism, and federal law enforcement, rest assured those protections will continue. But in the event of a shutdown, the federal officers who continue going to work protecting the public from violent crimes, gangs, and terrorists won't be getting a paycheck. They'll be getting an IOU. So basically what we'll be saying to these people, and what we are saying as of midnight last night, is thanks for putting your lives on the line, but we can't pay you right now because there's some people in the House that want to delay the Affordable Health Care Act. And if you're lucky, maybe you'll get back pay when Congress sorts this all out. My colleagues in the House like to talk a big game about how uncertainty is hindering real economic growth. I believe that uncertainty hinders economic growth. So it is quite ironic that they are now creating this economic uncertainty and willing to threaten our economy on a political gamble. Shutting down the government is not a negotiating tactic. If the House were to take up the Senate bill to fund the government, it is expected to pass and the shutdown would end. During that time, over the next 6 weeks, it will give us that time to truly negotiate a long-term debt deal done in a balanced way. Instead, critical services and the economic recovery are being threatened with poison pill partisanship. So to my colleagues in the House and the Senate, I say this: let's get this done. We owe it to the people we were elected to serve. We owe it to the country. Let's end this government shutdown now. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, today is the 1st of October. Today is a day that has long been known as a day when the Affordable Care Act will first come into force and exchanges across the country will begin to be open to citizens of all different backgrounds and walks of life for them to seek insurance, affordable, accessible insurance on these exchanges, the next step in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And on one level, it's a good day, because tens of millions of Americans are today gaining access to quality, affordable care. I'm told that since midnight, nearly 3 million people visited healthcare.gov, and 80,000 or more have called a hotline, and 60,000 have requested live chats. Applications and enrollment in these marketplaces are moving forward at a record pace. So on some level, this is an important day, because millions of Americans across dozens of states are getting access to quality, affordable health care. On the other hand, as you well know, Mr. President, this is an embarrassing, a difficult, a disappointing day. The federal government of the United States is shut down. As of midnight last night, the President and the Office of Management and Budget directed all the different executive agencies and offices to begin shutting down. 800,000 federal employees are spending today at home, not helping small businesses with loans from the SBA, not helping move forward grants that invest in improving our infrastructure, not moving forward federally funded research that might find the cure for cancer or for MS or for autism, not helping applicants get college loans, not helping disabled veterans get access to the benefits they earned through their service to our country. Mr. President, we could go on and on about all the different ways that these federal employees, these public servants, are today not able to help our constituents, our fellow citizens. And I've gotten a fair number of contacts today, phone calls to my office, emails to my office, folks connecting with me on Facebook or through Twitter or directly or indirectly, just to convey how frustrated and upset they are. And I just want to try and put all this in some context for the folks who might be watching. What is it we are fighting over? as best I can understand, a few members of this body and a few members of the House of Representatives have shut this government down in an effort to try and stop the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. That's what this is all about. They have refused to take up and pass a bill that would fund the continuation of the U.S. federal government. And in so doing, they're doing about $10 billion a week of damage to our economy. And they're doing all that damage I referred to in terms of hundreds of thousands of federal employees not able to help improve our communities or keep us safe or move our country forward. So why are we doing this? Mr. President, I think it's been said for many years that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Well, the House of Representatives has repealed the Affordable Care Act, I think 42 times now. And as best I understand, this bill, which was passed by both chambers and signed into law, and then challenged at length in the Supreme Court and upheld, and then the central issue of the last presidential election, which wasn't particularly close, this law of the land, which is moving forward in its implementation today, will not be stopped by shutting down the federal government. So this is a strategy that never really had a serious chance of success. And despite very, very long quasi-filibuster speeches on this floor, and despite all sorts of public pronouncements, this strategy had no chance, actually, of working. What is the point? Why is this federal government shut down? Mr. President, it seems to me that it's simply a demonstration of pique, a temper tantrum, a fit by a small number of folks who've promised people back home that they won't allow this government to go forward with the Affordable Care Act. And what I think we should be doing instead is working together across the aisle to improve the Affordable Care Act. It's not perfect. Of course, it's got blemishes. There will be hiccups. There will be inconsistencies and issues that need to be worked out as this law is implemented. And we ought to be working together across the aisle, the Senate and House together, to make sure that it's done in an affordable, sustainable, and positive way, rather than a small minority digging in their heels and imposing all of this wreckage for their own partisan goals. Well, let me share with you some of the thoughts I've gotten from folks at home who are not exactly happy about our having a federal government shutdown today. First, Ray White of Ellendale, Delaware, wrote, "I'm a veteran and a U.S. government employee. The furlough and sequester we already went through back in August of this year cost me 20% of my paycheck for over a month, causing my bills to get out of control. I'd like to know how to make ends meet when I have no money to pay my bills, and lawmakers in the Capitol want to put me out of work again." Well, to Ray and your family, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the fact that we've got a few folks in the House of Representatives who won't take up a bill to keep our government open. As the senator from Minnesota just recently related, if the Speaker of the House would just let that bill get to the floor, it would pass. There are more than enough Democrats and Republicans in the House to pass that bill if the House would just take it up. I don't think there's any question who caused this shutdown and why. Chief Warrant Officer, second, Christopher Slicer of Newark, wrote me to say, "As a federal technician and Army National Guardsman, I find it ridiculous that those we've elected as our representatives can't do their jobs. If I wasn't doing my job, I'd be fired or reprimanded. There's no excuse, and I don't care what party it is, for not passing whatever it is that needs to be done to have a budget. For our government to shut down shows how incompetent our government is to the world, and worse, its own citizens. There are thousands of us federal employees who've had to endure furloughs already, and you're telling me we may have more." Well, to Chief Warrant Officer Christopher Slicer, I apologize that this Congress is unable to come together across this partisan divide, and we have another needless manufactured crisis that just a few irresponsible members insisted on to make a partisan point. I think Chief Warrant Officer Christopher Slicer makes a particularly important point, that this government shutdown shows our weaknesses, our inabilities to get together across this partisan divide, not just to our citizens, but to the world. And at a time of real instability and real threats to our national security around the world, I think this government shutdown is not just harmful to our communities, our families, our economy, but to our country and its standing in the world. Last, I'll read, if I might, a note from Lori Tonke of Dover. Lori wrote me to say, it seems like we just got through the government furloughs, and now there's a good chance you're going to shut down the government. This came yesterday. My husband is employed at Dover Air Force Base on civil service. This makes it difficult for ordinary families to make ends meet. I'm getting discouraged with the way things are being done in Washington these days. America's in debt because we overspend. Then you make hard-working average employees pay the price for it repeatedly. She concludes, morale is low, and frankly, I've lost confidence in the bureaucracy. I wonder if things would be different if this were an election year. Would you shut the government down then? I think not. Show you care and get something done now. Well, to Lori, I'm sorry for the impact on you and your family of this shutdown, but it is the result of a few irresponsible members of the House of Representatives. If the Speaker would just put on the floor for a vote what has been passed here in the Senate, we would have a government reopened today, and we could get back to the business of this country. We could get back to conference on the budget and make progress on investing in making our communities safer, our families stronger, our schools and our students better educated, and in doing the investment in our infrastructure and research we need to move our economy forward. Let me conclude by sharing with you this. I have a number of wonderful folks on my staff who work in my offices in Delaware and in Washington, whose real focus is constituent service. When folks call my office and they've got a problem or an issue at home that we need to help with, they do an amazing job. One young man, Brendan Mackey, recently joined my staff. He's a two-tour veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq, and he works tirelessly to make sure that the veterans who contact my office get the help they need. A staff sergeant recently contacted us. He'd been wounded in Baghdad in 2007 by an IED, and he'd lost the documentation for his Purple Heart. Well, Brendan dove right in and did all sorts of work, collected sworn statements and medical records, and submitted everything to the relevant Army Review Board, and has managed to get his Purple Heart reissued. That's the kind of casework that my folks do day in and day out, making sure that whether it's accessing veterans benefits or disability benefits, Social Security, or medals earned in service to this nation in combat, that the men and women of Delaware who contact my office and who rely on me and their services for great constituent support can get that help. Well, sadly, Brendan is home today, not able to serve the people of Delaware, not able to do his job. If I might, Mr. President, I simply close by saying this. This is the latest in a series of manufactured crises, of completely senseless, self-inflicted wounds. And it is up to the Speaker of the House and the folks in the House of Representatives to take up and pass the bill we have sent them days ago that would allow this government to reopen and allow the leaders of this chamber and the other chamber to move forward on dealing with the real issues facing our country. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.